Now, a big welcome to another episode of the Championing Creativity podcast. In this episode, I sit down with Charlie Perry, founder of Astrid. Astrid is a podcast production studio and behind popular shows like He Said, She Said, Closet Confessions, Stompcast, and The Body Coach. In this episode, Charlie discusses her early podcasting experience working at Social Chain, the process of launching a business during the pandemic, and how she's grown her bootstrap business to 1 million in turnover this year. Now, onto the episode. Well, Charlie Perry, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
No, thanks for making the time. And for people that may not know you, are you able to give us a quick introduction?
Absolutely, yes. So I'm Charlie Perry. I'm the founder of Astrid. We are a podcast network and we make shows primarily for female audiences, which basically means that we are a team of producers who produce audiovisual shows sort of within the entertainment space. And the sort of female angle really is because as an all-female team, we know that we are really good at making shows for people like us. And that sort of spans across the entire industry. You'll find that there's most football shows are produced by people that are obsessed with football, regardless of gender. And I think that the sort of female space has been very much underrepresented by talent and behind the camera. So, that's our sort of, I guess, who we are, what we do, and why we do it.
Brilliant. And I think I might have seen this in one of your YouTube videos, but I believe you mentioned you always wanted to be a business owner. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a funny one. I think I always wanted to be a business owner because I never had the academic skills to know that I would be able to sort of be a successful lawyer or be a doctor or like these like real traditional, bearing in mind I started school in 2004. So I was very much sort of like, there was no media other than newspapers and TV. And I think, and obviously radio, and I think that ultimately meant that I was always very career driven. I was always very hardworking. And I think the only way that I could ever envisage that working out for me in the long run and finding somewhere where I felt like I actually was adding something to my job or my career was to have ownership in it. And I actually think a large part of that was probably just really naive. I think to start a business and to want to start a business takes a certain level of naivety. And that's not a bad thing. I think I spoke on the video that you're talking about how I probably didn't feel good enough because all of my friends were out there getting A stars and I was like a solid B or C student with a few A's and A stars sprinkled in there, very few and far between. But I think I just felt like I had something to prove to myself, and knowing I wouldn't be able to rely on these traditional career paths meant that I had to think outside the box a bit. And yeah, somehow I got to that. Nobody in my family is a business owner. So it's not like I've looked at someone and been like, I want to do that.
Mm-hmm. I can relate because I'm a fellow B/C student, I think, in the school. So it just kind of, you do think in school that just because you're not getting A's and A stars, that's going to be you forever.
Well, yeah, because you just sort of confined within I don't know what the solution is to this problem, by the way. It's just an observation that I think you sort of confined in this very important structure of our society, which is our education system, where you sort of basically just having to remember stuff to then regurgitate it down on a page. Like the only things I ever really remember from school were the things I was genuinely interested in. And I actually loved maths. I loved it so much. I loved the lessons. I loved the problem solving. I loved figuring out like why you would get to a certain number, but then I would go in an exam and I would completely flunk it because I just didn't know which theory to apply to the question. And that was the tricky part. And I think that always made me feel quite sad because I was like, but I like this. I'm just not good at it. And I think sometimes I think I don't know whether you feel the same. It's sort of operating in that same sort of grade space, I guess, that I kind of feel sorry for myself in like 2005, 2006, where I was just like, I want to be better than I am. I just can't figure out why my brain won't let me be that A-star student. But I don't know. I think it's school obviously offers a lot more than, grades and whatnot. It's like friends for life and all that kind of thing. But I do think it can create a bit of um, a, a vulnerability in a child who doesn't see a path for themselves. And I think that can be a bit concerning in some ways. And if you've got somebody who's hardworking and driven and whatever, then obviously they're going to be fine. But it is hard.
Yeah,
Sad,
yeah,
to be honest.
I agree. And based on you at an early age wanting to be a business owner, do you think people are born entrepreneurial, or do you think it's a skill that you could learn?
Um, do I think people are born entrepreneurial? That's a really hard question. I think no. If I'm go with my gut, I don't think people are born with it, because I think if you're not necessarily, I don't think it makes sense in my brain to have somebody who's like destined to be an entrepreneur. I think it comes from a place of a unique skill set and a unique problem that needs to be solved colliding. And I think when that one person has enough courage to take a risk, and that person has enough courage to trust themselves to put themselves out there and start a business and become an entrepreneur, I think that's where you become an entrepreneur. I don't think it comes from being born with this drive. I'm sure there are plenty of people out there that disagree with that, but I also think that there's a space in which there's people that think they want to be an entrepreneur and they think they're born for it, but actually when push comes to shove, they're a bit like, I'll be shoved.
This is hard, yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah. And your first job after you finished university was in radio. What did your day-to-day involve?
Yes, well, what's actually quite funny, and I think this is in relation to the previous question, my first job out of uni actually wasn't out of uni. My first job, I was working, my parents didn't let me not have a job throughout university, which I am the eldest daughter. I think that says a lot. And it effectively meant that my parents, who had both never been to university either, were like, well, how else are you going to survive? How else are you going to be able to buy food? Because you've got a maintenance loan that is peanuts and we can't afford to give you anything. So how is this going to work out? And so basically I worked the whole way through in a jewelry shop called Beaverbrooks when I was at uni. And when I took my holidays from Beaverbrooks, it was so that I could go and do internships in different radio companies. So I would, obviously, when I had my summer break at uni, I would work and then I would take annual leave and then I would take a summer internship down in London, and I'd be a runner. So I'd be like helping the exec producers, I'd be helping editing things. I was studying journalism, so I already had this like low level skill set that I was able to make use of in these places. I was writing call sheets, I was writing scripts, I was checking that we had all the right paperwork for a live show, that kind of thing. And then I'd go back up north and I'd carry on working. And then when I got to the end of university, because I'd spent all of that time making myself available, I couldn't afford to go on holiday anyway. So what else was I going to use my annual leave for? But then once I'd left uni, I just pinged all of those contacts an email and was like, hey, I finished uni now, I'm available. Um, do you have anything available, whatever it might be? And I then got a job as a freelance PA, a freelance AP at BBC Radio Sheffield, which is an assistant producer role. And that role basically, again, I was still working full time at Beaverbrooks. I was then doing some night shifts with the BBC or morning shifts, and I would sort of move my shifts around Beaverbrooks and the BBC. And then that ultimately allowed me to sort of flex a skill set when they needed me and they knew what I could do. I was at the BBC, I was sort of helping with the mid-morning show, which would mean I would find stories, I'd find callers, I would help edit the weather bulletin or the travel bulletin, that kind of thing. And then I would just sort of sit back and be the person that got the coffees and understood how the desks worked and all that kind of thing. And then once I'd done enough shifts there, I'd sort of saved my money from the BBC as sort of pocket money, because I was obviously earning my full-time wage at Beaverbrooks. And then I got an internship, an unpaid internship in London, which at the time was very common. But obviously I lived up north and had to save quite a lot of money in order to do that. So then I left Beaverbrooks, I took all the money that I'd saved, and I moved down to London for a few months and did this unpaid internship, which essentially allowed me to get a bit more sort of long-term on-the-ground experience in the industry. And I think in relation to the question you previously asked me, the reason why I think some people aren't born entrepreneurs is because I'm at uni, I'm writing a dissertation, I'm having to learn how to use cameras I've never learned before. I'm working a job which is using all of my shifts while also taking the annual leave from that to go and do stuff that I liked. That kind of, I don't think you're born with that kind of work ethic. I think you're born into an environment that you then make the most of. And even at the time when I was doing all of that, it didn't really feel like I was doing anything particularly strange or I wasn't working particularly hard. I was just like, I can make £100 if I go and do a shift at the BBC. So my day off from the jewelers, I'll do that. And then that will help me get a job down in London, which obviously came in the form of an unpaid internship. So I think all in all, I was juggling a lot of stuff, but I think really it just meant that I had this like very high ability to be able to just do it um, in a way that I don't think is tied necessarily to anything other than just wanting to get on with it and enjoying something and being interested in it and wanting to do it as a full-time job. So yeah, that was a very long-winded answer. I'm sorry.
No, that's brilliant. So you would essentially use your savings from all the shifts you'd worked up. You had to pay for rent in London
Yeah.
to do an internship. Was it one of the big radio stations? Was it global or?
No, it was actually it was more of an agency. So the funny thing as well was that I once got I made a friend at BBC Radio 1 because I don't know if you remember, but back in the day, Greg James used to do this thing on a Friday night where he'd get people to come in from different universities and you would like pitch your songs or you could sort of do like a mini presenter thing. I can't really remember exactly what it was called. But obviously studying journalism and being very heavily involved in radio, and me and all of my radio friends were like, oh my God, let's go. So we got accepted onto it. We won our pitch got through. We went down and then we were on the Greg James show and I made friends with the producer. So I was just very opportune. And so while I wasn't working for the BBC, while I was down doing the internship, I was having meetings with people at Radio 1. I was very interested in becoming a presenter. So I was doing some pilots at Radio 1. Somehow I ended up speaking to someone from Radio X, and I was doing a few pilots there as well, while I was also working down at a company called TBI Media. And they basically made shows on behalf of the BBC. So while I wasn't working directly within these big sort of corporations, I was making the shows with them. So I think a couple of the shows I was making was sort of like some of them were kind of religious segments on shows. So it was Pause for Thought on Radio 2, which is actually still a thing. And if ever I catch it, if ever my routine sort of shifts and changes and I hear Pause for Thought, I'm like, oh my God, I remember when I was having to edit that and then put it out on iPlayer. Like that was my role. So it was interesting because it was very varied. It wasn't just the BBC. It was like, I think we were helping out on a live show for oh God, I can't remember the name of the station now. It was like like Amazing FM or something. I don't know. It's not classic FM. I don't know, something like that. So I worked on a varied amount of shows for different networks, really.
And then after the experience finished, you went to Social Chain, which is the agency that was run by Don McGregor and Stephen Bartlett. Was that straight after that, or was there like a time in between?
No. So when I was working in London on the internship, they very kindly offered me a job as a assistant producer, but for somebody who lived up north, I couldn't afford I didn't basically it was a wage that meant that you had to be living with your parents in order to take that job. And my parents don't live in London. I didn't have any family in London. I had family sort of on the outskirts, but I wasn't going to go and live with them. Um, and so I then was like, well, I can't accept the job. I can't afford to accept the job. I always had in the back of my mind, I was like, I loved living in London. I thought it was really fun. I know I'll be back at some point when I can afford it. Um, so then I finished the unpaid internship. I went back to Doncaster. I just got a random part-time job. I was still helping with the BBC on a very ad hoc basis. Just doing a few shifts here and there, but I was working in basically a 9 to 5 in like a local recycling company, which was round the corner from where my parents lived. And I just saved up my money from that and then moved. I did a bit of traveling. I can't remember the order of everything, but I'd saved up to go traveling. Actually, was that it? I'd already traveled, then I went to London. That was it. So yeah, I'd gone back up. I'd saved my money to travel, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Came back, did the London thing, then went to Manchester because I essentially, sorry, scratch that, go back. So I went back to Doncaster. I was working this 9 to 5. It was a very, 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 very boring job. I was literally answering phones and I was a key account manager. And I was having to deal with people who'd ordered skips for large scale building developments. And so I was like, well, obviously I don't really want to do this, and obviously no shade to that at all. But it's the only reason why I think that's funny is because my brain is so creative, and that just obviously was not my calling in life. And I knew it was just to make ends meet, but I basically saved all of that up while I was looking for radio jobs. And then I got a job in Manchester at a really small startup station, which was an absolute nightmare, to be completely honest with you. But I was a presenter there and I was a producer. And while I was there, the relevancy of that place being a nightmare is actually because radio was sort of starting to die out. It wasn't what it used to be. People weren't consuming it the way that they used to consume it. And so it just sort of fizzled. And it was really hard for me to get people to go and listen to my show because it just wasn't the natural thing for people to go and turn the radio on. And so I just thought, okay, well, that's not really working out. I don't love the environment of this place. What am I actually interested in? And there was a really big street food scene in Manchester at the time. And I had the idea that I pitched to my sort of higher ups and said, can I make a social media series that is around the street food in sort of culture in Manchester? And they were like, yeah, go do whatever you want. I was like, okay, fine. Filmed it, like basically reached out to all these different street food vendors, learned about the culture, learned about like why that specific type of food. And then that performed really well on social media. And so it was a sort of Facebook days. So we would put the video on Facebook in full, people would watch it, get loads of engagement. We were helping promote like local culture and cuisine anyway. And then that place shut down because obviously it was a nightmare. No one was paying attention to it. They didn't know how to monetize these social series. But then I'd earned another skill off the back of making that a success. And so while I was sort of job hunting, I ended up working in a chicken street food. One of the street food vendors was like, I've seen that place is closed down. Do you want to help me on a few stalls? And I was like, yeah, okay, fine. So I was working with one of the guys that I'd met on the show. And then I was like, I'll just find a job at some point. And then the social chain opportunity came up. And that was basically, I was freelancing as a content developer. And the reason why I had won that pitch was because, or that won that job was because I had already done it. I just needed more availability to be able to do it. And they were working on something that I can't share the ins and outs of. It never went live, but NDAs, whatever. And they just needed somebody who could come up with some social first ideas. It would live on YouTube, it would be shared across social, whatever. And so I went and did that. And then as that project was wrapping up, Steve had seen that my background was in sort of obviously the social bits and bobs that I'd done, but in radio, in podcasting, because I had done that a little bit at the previous place where I'd done the social series as well. And he was like, oh, I've got this podcast, and I want to take it a bit more seriously, but I also want to offer podcasting to our clients of Social Chain as well. So are you interested? And I was just like, well, yeah, obviously I'm interested, because I don't have another job lined up after this one. So I want to stay. I love the environment, made some really good friends there. It was very creative. And this sounded interesting to like double down on podcasting, which was not too far from my original love of radio. So then there was a couple of team members on Steve's side who was helping him with the show, and he was literally just filming in his airing cupboard, and it was just him, and he was reading his diary out. It was very, very early stages diary of a CEO. And yeah, I just sort of built out what that offering was. So I was sort of working on my own for a while, and then Pretty Little Thing decided they wanted a show. I worked on the development of that, what the format was, how it would sort of come to life. Worked very closely with the team at PLT, launched that, and then off the back of that, I was just way too busy. So we started to develop and grow the team at Social Chain. And then that just sort of ended up with when we were in COVID era, and then that was like the last job I had before I started Astrid. So that's like a brief CV.
Yeah. No, and just going back on the Pretty Little Thing, because you were fairly new at Social Chain, and I think you mentioned before that you had quite a lot of expectations on that podcast.
Yeah. So PLT were Social Chain's biggest client, and so Steve had a lot of pressure to make sure that everything was going really well with that, understandably. And he was also really good friends with the founder. And so at the time, it was very much like let's see where this goes. I think Steve sort of wanted to test what could be done in podcasting. It was very, very new at the time. I think there was a couple of branded podcasts out, and there really weren't many huge podcasts that were UK based. A lot of the UK market at the time was full of American shows, and so it was a good chance for us to sort of build it. And I think the pressure ultimately was that they wanted to go to number one on launch, which obviously everybody wants that. But the thing is that I was sort of thrown in the deep end, having to produce all of this myself with an account manager at Social Chain and a videographer at Social Chain, because I didn't know how to use cameras well back then at all. And then there was basically I didn't know how the algorithm worked. Nobody knew how the algorithm worked at Apple, because they've never publicly said it. Over time we sort of sussed it out.
Spotify podcast wasn't a thing back then, was it?
No, I don't think it was. I think people could listen on Spotify actually, but I don't think it was their priority. I think it was music was their sort of like key thing. It was a very pared back version of what the podcast industry and podcast apps are now. Back then. So yeah, Steve was basically like, we need this to go to number one. And I was like, I don't know how to get something to go to number one. We've pitched it, and that took me ages to figure out how we could do that, because I didn't have any contacts. You can't pay for that slot. That is basically an algorithm that we don't know the workings of. At Social Chain, we'd mastered every single algorithm that there possibly could have been. And then suddenly we've got a new one that we don't have any experience with. And so the pressure was on to make sure that the show that I was making single-handedly, with the help of, like I said, these two other people, who were just organizational people. So that was stressful, but that was just coming from Steve as the business owner, wanting to make sure that his client was happy, and his client, it's just top-down pressure. And so anyway, the show went live, and I was like, oh my God, I am so nervous. Like, we'd scheduled it for midnight, as we always do, and we were like, let's just hope. Anyway, it gets like 9 a.m. and it's at number one. And I was like, oh my God, this is the best day of my life. This is so good. Like, I don't know how we've done it, but at least now I know it's possible. I can reverse engineer it, and I can try and figure out exactly what made that happen. And so, yeah, we went to number one. We stayed at number one. We stayed in the top 10 for, I reckon, honestly, about a year. And that was just sort of in and out. And that really helped me really understand what was at play with that algorithm, and what was impacting it, to be honest. But yeah, it was.
How many episodes was it? Was it one a week, or was it?
It was one a week. We did a few live shows that was sort of all organised by the PLT team, though, to be honest. And then it was one of those shows where we would do it on a seasonal basis, and the set would change. And so I think it's a really nice example of how something can go from being like a pink colorama, which is like paper that you just pull down from the ceiling with 2 seats in front of it and some microphones, to then being like a fully designed branded set with like an amazing lighting rig, an amazing like huge team that was then behind it, because we were able, off the back of the success, like they wanted to keep making it, and so there was more budget to be able to have more fun. Um,
Yeah,
so
and starting at one is obviously great because that was the expectation, but then you have to maintain that. So was there a lot of pressure to keep every episode at number one?
yeah, there was, but only to, again, probably just like we've done it, we've been there once before, so why can't we
Yeah,
be there
yeah,
again?
sure.
And that was actually probably one of the biggest learnings about the algorithm, and like what strengths you need to play to, because it's not necessarily about the algorithm is so heavily dependent on new people coming in. And at the time, this was like no Instagram Reels, no TikTok. There was no TikTok. It was like Musically, and everyone was like, "Is that even worth our time?" Like, that just been bought by someone. And so we basically only had the ability to put a square video onto Instagram and try to get people to go and then listen to the show. There was no swipe up. Oh no, there was a swipe up link. There wasn't when we first launched, and then the swipe up link happened, and that was really pivotal because it meant that people could just directly go to the episode. Um, and I remember having to like brief the people, like the guests being like, "Hey, my name's this person, swipe up." Like, we were having to get people to make that kind of social clip to get people to go, but it was very hard, it was very clunky, and it was like the migration of people from social to podcast was interesting, but also the strategy then, which isn't always the best strategy now, is that we were just trying to book the biggest, best guests to come on the show, and then they would post it on their Instagram story or something like that.
Attract the visitors, sure.
Mm.
Working with Stephen Bartlett, was it clear that he would go on to have the career he's had?
Um, in a way, yeah. I guess it's sort of, I never worked with him in a capacity of like getting the innermost thoughts of his brain. Obviously, he had his show, and that was quickly handed over to one of the other team members, because I was focusing on the PLT stuff, and we had another guy on the team called Adam who would do the audio edits for Steve. Um, and so I never really had to be that person. He had his own personal brand team in Social Chain, and there was just like a lot of people doing a lot of different things and all coming together to sort of build this bigger picture. So obviously there's so much credit to the wider team at play there. But I think it was always obvious that Steve would be successful because he already was successful, and he'd already sort of had this hardship story of, you know, just trying to make ends meet, having these ideas, them not working out, trying something different. Um, and so I don't think it was necessarily clear what he would go on to do, but I think it was very clear that he would just obviously be a continued success. And I, funnily enough, coincidentally, left at the same time. So I'd handed my notice in sort of mid-August and was working my notice period. And during my notice period, they announced that Steve and Dom were leaving. And so I think it was basically a week apart of me leaving and them leaving. So I don't know what Social Chain is like now, and obviously I haven't worked with Steve and Dom since I left, but it was pretty obvious that Steve obviously owned Diary of a CEO. That was a separate thing to Social Chain, although he was obviously using resource to be able to make it. It meant that it was obvious that with the rise of podcasting that he was then going to go and put all of his effort there. And I think one thing that's so important to remember when you look at the rise of a podcast like that is that the amount of money that was available to be able to invest into a show that was already a success is what most people don't have in this industry. It's what most people don't have in business. And Steve had Social Chain, he raised investment, he had his exit, and then the money he made from the exit he put into the one thing he did own, which was Diary of a CEO. And being able to have that team off the ground, because Diary of a CEO, yeah, it's a podcast, but it's a business first and foremost. In order for that to scale and grow so quickly, it relied so heavily on the groundwork and the finances that were available because of, the previous role. So, yeah, I guess he was always going to go on to make a success of whatever he was doing, and he's doing really well.
Now, on to Astrid. So you launched Astrid during COVID. Did it feel like a risk? Because I know podcasting was big then, but it's obviously was nothing like it is now.
Yeah, it was a big risk. It was I didn't so I'd basically used my furlough to develop what it was. For a background context, I'd sort of come to the end of my creativity with PLT. I was ready for the next career move. And so I'd already started before COVID, I'd already started looking at what other opportunities were out there, and then realized I would just go from producing one show or a few shows that I wasn't emotionally invested in into some more shows that I wasn't emotionally invested in. And so I just didn't see the point in moving from one to the other. And then COVID was quite timely. Obviously, we couldn't go into studios because we knew it was airborne, whatever. It was such a weird time then. But I was put on furlough, and I basically just spent that time plotting out what I wanted to do next. And within that became Astrid. And so then when I was asked to go back, I was like, well, I'm going to hand my notice in and I'm going to take the risk. And I just I'd saved a tiny bit of money. I had like £2,000. I was like, okay, well, my life at the time wasn't expensive. I was very fortunate to have a low rent situation. The environment was right, but it still felt like a massive risk because I'd left just like sustainable income to then go and do something that I didn't know whether would work or not. But the entire time I just thought, well, I trust myself to be able to do it. It's a skill set in an industry that is massively rapidly growing and everybody wants a bit. I can basically email or message anyone on LinkedIn and say, hey, I used to work for Steve Bartlett at his company. I made PLT's podcast, which still at the time was a very well-known show. And the majority of people came back and said yes. Like people at these like global companies that I just thought would never be interested in hearing from me. Just like, yeah, sure. Let's chat. And so I would go and have these conversations, and sometimes it didn't amount to anything, but then my name was on the map, and it's so sort of word of mouth that it only felt like a risk because I was sort of waiting for the first lot of income to come through. And then we secured some clients through people I knew. Then that started to allow us to have case studies that helped secure clients that I didn't know, who had just heard about us or had seen a LinkedIn post I'd made, which I really didn't post that much on LinkedIn. It was mostly just used for reach out. And yeah, that was sort of the way I went about it, and it felt really scary. But again, at the back of my head, I just thought, I can go back. Like I can freelance, I can go back. And also I've already seen all of these other jobs that are trying to find a producer. Even though I don't love the shows, it's an option. I think I just had nothing to lose. And I think for some people, it would feel a lot riskier if you've got kids, or you've got a particularly high income, or you've got a particularly expensive life if you live in an expensive area or whatever, and you've got those commitments. I think in comparison to those people, this wouldn't feel as risky as that. But at the time, I couldn't rely on my parents to just fund my life. They've never done that because I've always had to work. And I guess I always just thought, I can go back to Beaverbrooks. I can go back to the BBC. I can just go back into something. There will be something there. And that was sort of a de-risked mental attitude, I think, that I just took into it, and it worked really well.
Yeah. I know when we spoke 5 years ago when I was at an agency, it just seems at a time where every meeting you went into, everyone was discussing about starting a branded podcast.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I feel like as well, I spoke to, I'm only maybe 5 episodes into this podcast, but a lot of the business owners I speak to, probably about 80% of them have all mentioned how COVID was this time where they slowed down, they could think about and plan what their business.
Yeah, I genuinely, I wouldn't have been able to start Astrid if it wasn't for COVID. I wouldn't have had the ability to save money. The reason why I didn't have a lot of savings was because I'd obviously, like I said, I'd been traveling, I'd done unpaid internships, I'd had to have jobs to save up to do what I wanted to do. And then I moved to a city, and the job where I made the social format, I was literally paid £18,000 to live in the UK's major cities. I couldn't afford it. I was like down to the penny. I had no savings. That shut down. I was working in the chicken shop before I got the social chain job. The social chain job led to another social chain job, which then just continued. And it was one of those things where it was expensive to live there. It was a hell of a lot more expensive than the city I'm from. And so it's one of those things where y- I wouldn't have I wouldn't have had that financial buffer to be able to say, okay, well, at least I've got that. That's going to cover me for a couple of months. And also, it was quite hard for podcasting because people were recording everything in person and suddenly they couldn't anymore. So I also had to be very quick and dynamic in like, how can I make it remote? How can I make sure that I can offer that to people? And also, I think it's a pretty good bet when you can see a very successful business person go on to put their investment into that same industry. It's a pretty good indicator that it's an industry that's worth taking a risk with. And like I said at the start of our interview, it's so much of it is just naivety, being like, well, I produced Pretty Little Things show and I worked there. Why can't I just go and do that on my own? And the answer is there wasn't any reason I couldn't do that on my own until it gets into this sort of like big business model brain where you're like, oh God, okay, well, scaling, growing, cash flow, cash burn, all that kind of thing that you just suddenly like, okay, wow, that was more than I
Yeah.
expected.
And how quick was the business able to grow? I know you said you started with £2,000.
Yeah, well, it was more that I could do everything in the business. So I was just offering all of my skills. There wasn't anything I couldn't do because I'd had to do it for PLT. And so I just knew that it was just became a capacity thing. It was more of a, how long is this going to last? It's a buffer for me to get a new client to start with. Then when I got the client, I was like, okay, well, now it just becomes a capacity thing. Like, when does my first hire come? And so I started with the £2,000 in the October. By the January, I'd hired my first member of staff, who then took off the editing because that was what was taking me so long. So I just outsourced the longest task. She's still within the business. She's an amazing member of staff and she's sort of grown and developed as well. But in terms of growing from there, it was very much a whatever happens, whatever we bring in, we have to just manage the cash flow in order to not put too much stress on the business, but also make sure we can maintain these clients. Um, and from a growth perspective, I guess I think the first year of revenue was like £75,000, which was mind blowing for me at the time. I was like, I didn't even know anybody that earned £75,000 a year, full stop. So for me to then be like, oh, my accountants are saying that the revenue was 75k in the first year for a business I'd just started on a risk with £2,000. I think that was the moment where I was kind of like, okay, well, I can really run with this. And then we sort of doubled growth year on year. And it was one of those, how quickly do you grow is also a bit of a risk of growing too fast, right? There's a risk of getting all these contracts and not finding the right staff or not being able to execute on them in a high quality way. I think we grew in a really sustainable way, and I think I've very openly shared the numbers that we've made in revenue, which this year we hit 1 million in revenue. And yeah, there's so many costs involved, but what I can hand on heart say is that we've been profitable every year and we've grown doubled revenue every year, to the point where now we're able to invest in ourselves. I can't imagine that the next year is going to show me double growth, huge levels of profit, but that's because we're reinvesting in shows that are costing us money to make, and then we have the ownership in them. So it's a really interesting question, depending on how you want to measure growth, whether it's staff, whether it's revenue, whether it's what you own. It's a it's a it's a broad question, but I think the growth that we've seen has already exceeded any of my expectations,
Mhm.
to be perfectly honest.
And what's the current team look like? How many employees are in the business, and do you use freelancers as well? Or?
Yes, so I try to keep everything in-house if I can. The main reason for that is that I think it just obviously from a productions perspective, I want to make sure that the team are like they actually like their jobs and they like the shows they work on, because I think that comes through in the production and it comes through in um how much the audience enjoy it, how much they resonate with it, why it's interesting. But then there are also obviously times when people are on holiday or whatever and we'll use freelance availability. Um, the team is currently structured between production management, producers, video, and then there's myself. So we've currently got um 5 members of staff, and I'm hoping by the end of quarter 1 next year, I don't know when this is going to go live. I'm hoping that early 2026 we're able to sort of push into those next hires. Um, and I'm going to keep my lips sealed about how that is, but I'm being very strategic in how we can actually step away from only being production and how we move more into being this sort of fully fledged media brand for women. And that is it's a very exciting step, but it's very daunting because it's what I always wanted us to be. I always wanted us to have our own shows. I always wanted Astrid to be the focus because we're so mission led that there's just no way that it doesn't resonate with people. But we've not necessarily had the capacity to be able to focus on that because we've just had to make the revenue to keep us going because of the bootstrap nature and starting with a small amount of money. So I think the opportunity that we have coming for us next year is very exciting. So yeah, it's a primarily production team for now, but we'll see where that goes.
Brilliant, exciting.
Mhm.
You've produced some very big podcasts. So He Said, She Said, Closet Confessions. You do the Body Coach and a podcast with Dr. Alex.
Mhm.
How did you manage to win these clients? Was it through, you mentioned earlier, LinkedIn outreach was one form at the beginning. Do you have a lot of referrals as well?
Yeah, a lot of it's referrals. A lot of it is also, I think the main strategy that I employed was figuring out who the clients were that I wanted, who would have budget. It's all well and good being like, I want to work with this person, but if they couldn't afford to pay us, we couldn't afford to fund their show. So it was a bit of a no-brainer. So I basically listed out brands that I wanted to work with, that I liked, that I thought would work well in the podcasting space, and then talent as well. And if I want to work with a brand, it's obviously coming out of the marketing budget. So the number one person I need to try and speak to is the CMO. If it's not the CMO, it's head of brand. Um, then the other thing was, if I want to work with a particular talent, I'm not going to send them a message. I'm going to send their manager a message. And so managers and the way that the management industry works is that they will manage a whole roster of people. They're not just looking after one person unless they've got in-house managers and assistants and whatnot. So I would essentially send our case study deck and say, hey, just want to put us on your radar in case any of your talent want to make a show. It's a really good way for people to engage. It's obviously, at the time, it was very much like everybody wanted a podcast. And so I just kept updating people. Like when we launched a new show, I'd update the deck, I'd send it out to the same people. And then that deck would just sort of get sent around. It was word of mouth. So if one talent had a friend who wanted a show, they'd be like, oh, it's this person that makes it. We'll put you in touch. So it was very much referrals based. But at the same time, there was some specific, like I'd say probably there was a level of 50-50. Some of them we would go after, and then that would lead on to another person, which would then lead on to another person and all that kind of thing. And also, people change jobs. This is one thing that I always say to, like, I've got some younger family members who are sort of like 16, 17. And I think one of the most important things is just remembering that, yeah, you might hate Sheila, who's really not got your best interests in HR or whatever, but when Sheila goes to work at Disney, where you've always wanted to work, best believe you're going to be having to deal with Sheila again at some point in the future. And that she's also your way in. So you need to, as much as you might hate working with some people, they're not going to be in that job forever. You're not going to be in that job forever. Just sort of remember that. And I think that me recognizing that very early on with all the different jobs I was managing then ultimately meant that when I was going out on my own, I was like, these are all the people I know. I'm going to watch where they're all going. I'm going to see the jobs that they're getting. And then I'm just going to reach out and say hi and be like, hey, I never know where this is going to take me. So yeah, it was each specific job sort of had its own routes. But then there's also people that I'd like randomly made friends with on Instagram or through a different podcast, and we were just chatting and we were friends, and then they knew somebody who wanted a show and we were like, okay, yeah, cool, let's have a chat, let's see what we do. And I think that's particularly nice when it's word of mouth, because people sort of already get you, they've already been given this, like, this is who they are, this is what they do, this is how they work. And you can just sort of focus on that relationship building.
It's a really good piece of advice, especially within marketing, how people jump around jobs a lot really quicker than other industries.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, definitely.
what's been your favourite moment since running Astrid?
Oh, favorite moment. This is kind of maybe a bit of a left field one, but I remember I'd launched a show called Nip Tuck, and it's still a show now. We don't produce it anymore. It was hosted by Ashley Stobart and her friend Lauren, who's now Lauren Adamson, and it was just a sort of like, one of my friends had put me in touch with Ashley, and then we just had like a phone call, and she was just like, I've had this idea. Some people think like we should do it. What do you think? And I was like, yeah, let's do it. Like, let's try. And that was one of the first shows that I was very much, it wasn't my first client, but it was one of the first entertainment shows that I'd done. A lot of the other pieces before that had been brands or had been a business founder wanting to tell their business story, but this was just like pure entertainment. And we launched it, and I'd had a few podcasts like Get on the New and Noteworthy on Apple. I'd pitched them for that. They'd been successful, but none of them had gone into the charts yet. And then got to number one. And I was like, oh my God, I've done it on my own. Like I've actually done it on my own. I've taken a show and I've put it there, and it just felt like a real like co-production. It felt like I understood them, they understood me and Abby. We knew what we were doing. They knew what they were doing. We knew exactly what the audience wanted. And I think that really was my first taste of working with talent who had a very highly engaged audience, because people were just there for it. And that was that they are such amazing girls, and the show is so big now. I just think it was a moment that I don't think I'll forget it, because I remember just thinking, God, it's not a fluke.
Yeah, you've got
Like,
the
you are
proof now that you
actually,
could do it.
yeah, exactly. So I think that was particularly exciting. And then there's just like seeing Closet going, to be fair, I'm also sort of missing out some of the later stuff that happened, like Closet Confessions. We went and took them on a tour. They sold out the London Palladium, which was insane. But then also, while I was working for TBI Media, who I'd mentioned earlier on the unpaid internship, I was doing I can't remember what this, Absolute Radio, that was it. It was Absolute Radio. They had a Christmas show that we were like doing at the Palladium, and I was a runner for that show, and I obviously wasn't getting paid. It was like a Sunday, it was cold and it was rainy and the tubes were down and all this horrible stuff had happened. And I was just like, this is hellish, and I'm not even getting paid for it. Like, I hate this. I don't know why I'm here. I just want to be eating a Sunday dinner with my family up in Doncaster. But then the time after I went back to the Palladium, after I'd left on that day, was to go with Closet Confessions on their sold out tour and be the person backstage that was like, here they are, like introducing them on stage, and like the buzz and the audience and everybody that was in the room. It was so good. And that was a real sort of like, that was a full circle moment that I think is um, a really big moment, to be honest, because you can do all the charts and you can do all that kind of thing, but then actually you do just have those little moments where you're like, oh shit, I actually did all right there.
That's brilliant. But then on the other side, there's been a lot of success in your business, but has there been any really tough moments? Have you ever felt like quitting at any points?
Yeah, God, there's been a lot actually. I think running a bootstrap business brings the obvious stresses with it. It's like a financial thing. Um, the sort of pivot we've taken in the last sort of year and a half-ish has been obviously very strategic and what the plan always was, but I think it also timed very well with, um, you know, having to there was essentially a situation I was in whereby I had somebody that was wanting to make a show, and we'd agreed everything and they were happy with it, and then suddenly they'd launched it, it was out in the world, and they got so much hate for it because they were very unfortunate. It was very unjust. Um, and it was actually nothing to do with them and it was nothing to do with us. But she was like, I can't do this. I can't put myself out there and just get these trolls coming at me every week. And I'm not going to be there to be the one that's like, well, you owe me another at least 8 episodes to get through this. Um, and she's not going to pay to make those episodes that she's not going to be doing. Like there was no, it was just a really awful situation to be in, but it might massively financially messed up the business.
Yeah.
Um,
And you had a contract in place, so they had to commit to these episodes. And
yeah, and the person that was the manager, I was really close with. I knew her, and it was so awful because it was like this, the comments and the nasty, horrible messages that she was getting. It's not. It it was that was bad. That was really bad, and you also, I can't sit there and be like, you owe me money and you owe me more money in the future because I've been relying on your contract to make sure I can pay my team. And that sort of ended up actually being a bit of a domino effect and being it got into a really dark place because that happened at actually a relatively um sort of awkward time in the industry because it was when it was quiet. It had happened before I knew there was a pattern of people, a lot of inbound, or before I knew really how I could market myself because so much had been word of mouth. And losing that contract was like, yeah, it was financial, but then it also became an emotional pressure. And on top of that, I'm sort of split between Manchester and I'm split between London, and it was really bad. And ultimately, the only way I could get out of it was to get more contracts. And we were just about to go into Christmas. Like we were about basically everybody knows in marketing that the Christmas stuff has been planned 3 months in advance at the very latest. Like we are now in the moment where people are probably starting to wrap on their Christmas stuff. And all they're trying to do is get through to the end because people are going on holiday. People are doing all sorts of stuff. There's annual leave that's going to be taken, loads of bank holidays. And then we're all going to come back in January. And that's when I was expecting sort of a bit of an influx. And that obviously did happen. Um, but it's a really, I don't think there's ever been times in the business that have been horrible or stressful or unenjoyable because of anything other than finances. But again, I just think that's the risk you're taking at the end of the day. The reason why running a business and starting a business feels risky is because of money. If that is a long and short form of it. And I think I just obviously didn't have any backing of money. I didn't have a safety net, a personal safety net. I was taking as little out of the business as I possibly could to pay myself to keep it going. And then when something just gets pulled from under your feet, which by the way has happened many more times since and has consistently had the same effect on the business, it gets really tricky. But now the way that we operate is we don't rely solely on those contracts because we develop our own ideas and we work in revenue shares. And so yes, we have to front the staff. The staff are being paid by the other contracts that we're managing to maintain. And then from that, we're able to then reinvest whatever we do have left over into new shows. And a lot of those other contracts are branded pieces. Even though they've got a sort of a person at the front who is very much tied to the brand, it's still being paid for by the brand. So yeah, I think it's always just come down to failed contracts, to be honest, or people that have sort of, yeah, negotiated funny clauses, probably know what they wanted to do down the line. And then us not having a choice but to agree to it because we needed to do it. And it's sad, but that's the nature of running a bootstrap business, I think.
Mhm. And you've produced a lot of podcasts Do you know, is there a secret for a successful podcast? Can you tell when something's about to take off, or is it
Mm.
very random?
Is there a secret for a successful podcast? I very much ride on a real gut instinct. I'm not going to lie. There's like, I'll have some conversations and I'm like, that's a winner. And I'll have some conversations where I'm like, no, I, it's just not going to work. And obviously it changes, like podcasting has changed so much. Shows that we still produce when we started them are very different to how we produce them now. But I think consistently, the number one most important thing for a show to be a success, specifically a podcast, so for a podcast to be a success, is really, really good talent who are very open to a creative relationship and letting, like, not just using us as a post-production house, sort of working together, being really open to ideas, open to strategy, allowing us to sort of take the reins a little bit in certain areas. And having a really engaged audience, because one thing I will say is just because someone has got a lot of followers, and I think this is a lesson that marketers have learned a few years ago, but just because someone has a lot of followers does not mean they're going to have a successful podcast. These people who are really good at podcasting have either an expertise that people want more from, or they have a very unique insight into their industry or whatever it might be that people want to hear more about, generating some curiosity, or they have already put themselves out there in a short form capacity or a sort of mid-length capacity that allows you to then take them into long form, and people just want more, and you can provide that for them, whether it's through entertainment, whether it's through value and information. If the host is not able to do any of those things, if they're not able to entertain or get some information across, you're pretty stuck. But what I will also say is that sort of putting a focus on talent sort of takes away from the value that a producer will bring. The value that an experienced podcast producer will bring is tenfold, 100-fold what somebody who can shoot and edit a video can do. And that is no shade to them, because there's amazing videographers out there, so many of them that we work with, but they also don't want to know the ins and outs of podcast industry because they're just really good at editing a snappy video. They've got an eye for some good motion graphics. They know how to make something pop. They know what performs well on social. And what we do, I think, really well is we provide this level of, credibility to be able to work with these big talent because we've got an amazing production team. And so they sort of work quite symbiotically. Um, but sadly, I don't think there is one secret to success, as I think it's the same with entrepreneurs. I think it's a unique subset of skills under the right environment that will let them flourish.
Hmm. And personally for you, I've noticed, we've been connected on LinkedIn for probably about 5 years now. And I've noticed you've started to really ramp up your own personal brand content. Is that something you're going to continue to do and focus on?
Yeah, it's a big focus for us to be able to do that. I actually today have said to the team that I once a week will just block off one full day, no meetings, no shoots, nothing external other than just doing marketing. Because I think, well, I was speaking at an event last week and Daniel Priestley was another speaker the following day. And if you've not, I'm sure everybody that listens to this podcast knows who Daniel Priestley is, and I'm sure they've read his books. But he has made such a good point, in that people connect with people. Everybody knows that already, and I've known that the whole time. I've been running Astrid, and the growth plan has always been that we need somebody at the front of it, because I can't expect people to connect with a brand where they're having conversations with you, but there is nobody there on the other side. And I think I always realized I needed to do it, but wasn't quite sure how. And I wasn't quite sure. I was quite nervous to do it, to be honest. I didn't really want my old colleagues to see what I was talking about, because obviously we worked at the same company. We had the same boss. Like, it's a really awkward thing to do. I made a new Instagram and only sent it to people that I knew would be open to supporting the fact that I've got a new page. And I think the personal brand sort of storyline that Daniel Priestley reiterated in his talk last week was that ultimately most leads will come through a person that people like, and it's very hard to build a business without a level of personal brand attached to it. And I've sort of semi-disliked the rod that I've built for myself, because is that the right word? Is that the right term? The rod in my own back? I've built a rod for my own back, whatever it is, because I don't really want to be somebody that's out there perceived as this like know-it-all businesswoman, because I'm not. I'm so open to share my own experiences and my own thoughts and my own sort of theories, but actually in my head getting those out into a piece of content is like I'm doing that for other people, and I've got a million things on my brain, and I actually find that quite hard, weirdly. But I think the sort of founder piece, you can't deny that people are interested in that. And I think if I can help another woman start a business and make it a success in whatever way, shape, or form that success means to them, then I'm happy with that. And so I think sort of succumbing to what I know works well and what I know I can offer, even though really I just want to entertain women and I want them to go over to Astrid and find a podcast that they love and connect with like-minded people as an audience member. That's my ultimate goal. I'm not doing any personal brand for anything other than connecting with other women who I think will benefit from the shows that I know that we make and that we will go on to make.
Yeah. And do you find being a young founder, has that put you off or made you postpone probably doing personal brand content? Because I know personally for me, I started doing quite a lot and then got quite busy with client work, so I put it on hold for a bit. But I almost had a point where I didn't want to post stuff because I didn't want to see someone I used to work with who's maybe 10 years more experienced than me saying, what's this guy doing, setting up his own business and trying to post advice when I've got more experience.
I don't think I've ever really thought about it in that way. I definitely relate to that feeling of being like the clients are more important, like 100%, because I can't be out here saying how amazing I am if my clients aren't happy. Unfortunately, that's not how the world works. So I definitely resonate with that. But I think the age thing, I don't think necessarily has been that much of a thing for me. But I also wonder if maybe I've never really thought of it. And I think my initial thought is that I was literally led by Steve Bartlett, who's almost exactly a year older than me. And so I was like, it was never an age thing. But I definitely felt like there's one of my good friends who, funnily enough, was in my brother's year at school. So she's from the same place as me in Doncaster. And she is called on Instagram Leadership Heather. And she basically makes leadership content. And she's my brother's age, 2 years younger than me. So she comes up against this quite a lot, because people will say to her, like, well, how do you know anything about management? You're however, you're 30 years older, you haven't got a clue. And she used to work on the shop floor in Harrods. Weirdly, when I was doing the internship, I went into Harrods around Christmas to get my grandma some chocolates or something. I walk into the food court, completely skint, obviously, and I see Heather stood there, and I'm like, why are we both here? This is so weird. Why are you working here? And why am I in Harrods when I've got about 5p to my name? So anyway, that was a really weird moment. And she looked very stressed and just like, she wasn't having a great time. It was obviously very busy in there around Christmas. And I just left her. I never said hi to her. We ended up reconnecting. And that moment for her in Harrods was a massive learning curve for her, because she was having to manage a team of people. At the time, she would have been about 21, 22, managing people on the Harrods food court floor. And she essentially went from there into working in a completely different job, but she was a manager again in a completely different industry. But she basically applied all of the theories and all of the things that she'd learned from the Harrods shop floor into this new business, and then became a really good manager. That business then got sold to Sage, and they were like, how have you managed to retain a team that are this driven to work and all these sort of amazing, have all these amazing accolades? and amazing achievements to their name. And she was like, just because I know about management, like I've been there, I've been in the worst types of management roles, and now I'm working in a completely different industry, but I'm really good at knowing how to be a manager, that she then left that job and started out on her own in a similar way to me, trying to help people become better managers and train people up. And she's now a certified management training company called Fresh Leadership World. She's called Heather Elkington. Her handle is Leadership Heather. Absolutely go and check her out. She's obviously shares so much on social, but all of the comments are just like, how would you know? How would you know? You don't know anything. And also her having to manage people who are like 20, 30 years older than her. That is tough. That's really hard. And so while that's not necessarily my story, it is absolutely hers, and she would be a great guest. I'm sure she would speak with you. But she's built an amazing platform and sort of uses that as her strength. She's like, well, if I can become an amazing manager, now she's 30 years old. If I can become an amazing manager at 30 years old, yeah, I think I've proved my worth. She's proved her weight in gold. So yeah, she's an interesting person to look at.
I'll try and get her on the podcast. Thanks for
Mm.
that. I always finish the podcast just on legacy, so I'll be interested to know what's the future hold for Astrid.
Oh, what does the future hold, or what do I want the legacy to be?
Where do you see Astrid probably in 5 years' time?
Okay, Astrid in 5 years' time, it will be a global women's media brand. It will be more than just podcasts. It will have podcasts at its core. It always will. But it will have fully fledged brands beneath it, across different verticals, across different interest fields. We'll have our own IP. I'd like to think that we're operating on a much higher level within media. We're able to have, by that I mean we're able to have an actual impact on culture and society in the work that we do. Will be globally recognized in terms of us having a US presence, which we already have to an extent with some of the shows that we've got. I would love to see what the Australian market holds for us. That I think is just more of a logistical thing with time zones and knowing how we can do that. But ultimately, the mission is to make a place where women are heard, and I think the only way that we can do that is to continue to put women at the front, put women behind the camera, and make the world a better place, because it's a much fairer place. And also, I would love to make sure that the podcast industry, the money that's made in it, I would love to see the percentage of revenue in podcasting through gender stats. I would imagine this is not a stat, but I would imagine that maybe 90% of revenue in the global podcast market goes to men. I would love to just see that much, much fairer. And I know that I'm sort of putting my finger in the air and making numbers up at this moment, but the majority of top performing shows are not hosted by women. And that makes me sad, because there's 51% of the UK is female. So 51% of the revenue should be going to women.
And do you know is there any kind of female podcasters in the space that you think are undervalued, or as many people know about them as you think they should?
Oh, that's a good question. There's obviously a lot of podcasts now. It's kind of a tricky question, but in general, rather than it being a specific podcaster, I would just speak to a specific niche within podcasting. I think that within the sort of political, financial news space, obviously there's some amazing female journalists that are hosting podcasts alongside a male anchor. I do just think they are often overlooked, and the audience, it's not necessarily, I think it's more that a female audience gets overlooked. For example, just to put this into like a real-time version of events, I was listening to a very interesting PR podcast. Sounds really boring, but it was really great. Basically took the headlines from the news and was like, this is how the PR have spun this. This is what they'll want to do for this person, whatever. And the whole time, it was hosted by two men, which didn't deter me from listening, just I might add. But the whole time, all they did was make jokes about football and rugby. And I was like, what? Like, I actually like football. I don't know the rules for rugby, to be perfectly honest. I'm not really from a rugby family, but that's not in. I don't know how Arsenal are doing in the table. I don't know how United are doing. I only know how the team I've grown up supporting, which is Liverpool, by the way, are doing because of my family. And so automatically, you have just siphoned off a whole bunch of women who were interested and now are just having to. It's a bit like being sat in the pub around your dad and his mates, just listening in until they ask you whether you want another drink. And you're like, oh, right, okay, yeah. Yeah, well, I'll have a medium rosé, thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for coming on, Charlie. You've been brilliant.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me. I've loved it.